Sustainable development has become the popularized expression for Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is the 1992 United Nations Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development.
It is the agenda for the 21st century you're living in today. For a brave new world where everything that you cherished and held true will no longer exist.
Agenda 21 defines itself as the comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations systems.
It also elevates nature above man. And it contains something called the precautionary principle, where basically you're guilty until you're proven innocent.
Sustainable development is the philosophy designed to bring human beings across the globe under the full control of a narrow human elite.
It's a 40-chapter document to basically control the world. It's based entirely on socialist control mechanisms.
Sustainable developers have designed a global movement coordinated through a global to local action plan to create world government in accordance with certain objectives. These objectives include an end to national sovereignty, the abolition of private property, the restructure of the family unit, and increasing limitations and restrictions on mobility and individual opportunity.
The green goal includes the listings of what's not sustainable. A couple of the examples include private property.
728 lists fossil fuels.
Golf courses and ski lodges are not.
Consumerism.
Irrigation is not sustainable.
Paved roads.
Commercial agriculture.
Herbicides, pesticides. Elsewhere, it lists farmlands, pastures, grazing of livestock.
And the family unit.
The focus of sustainable development is the abolition of private property, societal undermining of the family, and abandonment of the constitutional protection of unalienable rights as described in the Declaration of Independence.
You see, I sat on the Santa Cruz Agenda 21 committees. Now, this was a lot of crazy ideas. This was back in the mid-90s. Crazy ideas I heard. Mother Earth's surface wasn't to be scratched. Human beings were to be concentrated into human settlement zones. Educational systems were to focus on the environment as the central organizing principle. All aspects of life were covered. Well, I went to these committees at the request of some people who told me that I needed to understand what was going on, and I came back and I said, this is craziness. This is so silly. It has no chance of having any effect on our society. Well, I was wrong. The United States government's support for sustainable development, Agenda 21, is very clear. In 1992, while the Rio Conference was going on, George Bush, then president, was there where he executed the Agenda 21 protocols on behalf of the United States and brought it back to Washington, D.C. Within a year, Bill Clinton, by executive order, no congressional review, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. In Santa Cruz, we've got a 2-lane freeway system. We need 4, but what we're getting is hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money to take a dilapidated rail line that Southern Pacific wants to put in the hands of somebody else so that a commuter line can be built along the railroad track. That'll be followed by 14-story buildings where people will live and stack them and pack them units, where developers, or so-called sustainable developers, will build these high-rises with federal dollars. In fact, Santa Cruz has received a $300 million federal grant to build the first 3,000 of these stack them and pack them units. The County Board of Supervisors has said, if you are a sustainable developer, you're immune from any construction defect liability. It's a partnership between selected developers building this new world order and the government using the American taxpayer dollars in order to do it. This is a map of the Wildlands Project. To explain the map, the red are areas that are to be off limits to human beings. No resource development, no human activity. If you live there, you won't. The yellow areas are the areas for major control of all human activity. If you live there, you won't. The black areas, the black dots, are the smart growth zones. That's where human beings are to be stacked and packed in small living units along rail tracks. The smart growth program ultimately has jobs assigned and children cared for by the state.
The question has been asked many times how the people who are perpetrating these things expect to do this and make it last. And the answer to that is that you steal a generation of children and you indoctrinate them so that they accept these ideas and they become global citizens in the coming global village.
UNESCO came out and declared 2005 to 2015 the decade of education for sustainable development. But they go on to say that it will encompass the 40 chapters of Agenda 21. That is your federal national curriculum. The entire purpose of second grade social studies is to transfer loyalty from the family to the government and teach them about sustainable economic consumption. Students construct their own understandings of reality and realize that objective reality is not knowable. So why bother? The truth is, the truth, which keep men free, is being suppressed in order to prop up the attitude training agenda. And it moves on. This is our new math called connected mathematics. Standard 3 tells us that students learn that mathematics is man-made, that it is arbitrary, and good solutions are arrived at by consensus. Most of us assume 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4. You're wrong. We might reach a new consensus. How well does it work? Well, they tell you in the teacher's guide in the back, it tells us that because the curriculum doesn't emphasize arithmetic computations done by hand, some students may not do as well on tests assessing computational skills. We believe such a trade-off in the favor of CMP is very much to the student's advantage in the world of work. Our children are mathematically illiterate on purpose. How do I know on purpose? Why isn't this just a basic bad idea? Because the Sustainable Development Plan tells us so. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. Charlotte Iserby, I owe you an apology. I did not believe for the longest time it was a deliberate dumbing down. I thought the dumbing down was a natural consequence of a bad idea. Folks, it's deliberate. It's deliberate.
The sustainable globalist goal is the orchestration of a planned fall of American principles, values, and lifestyles. The effect on the average American will be devastating. With modernizing technology, the ordinary person will live without independence, privacy, or substantive rights.
Another press conference that I attended was the ICLE group, the International Committee for Local Environmental Initiatives. It helps in the implementation of Agenda 21 in all of our local communities. And one of the speakers was a Harvey Reuven, who happens to be the vice chair of ICLE. And I asked him about the correlative rights that Americans derive from the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And that, of course, is your individual liberties, your private property, your freedom of speech. Asked about it clashing with Agenda 21. And you know what his response was? Individual rights must take a back seat to the collective.
name is Scott Stevens. I was a television weatherman for 20 years. These chemtrails are absolutely required to impact whatever weather event they were designing. And the trails were an absolute necessary ingredient for them to achieve their weather modification goals.
Chemtrails are a key element in the whole thing because they're obviously a way of putting a highly reflective material into the atmosphere.
With cloud seeding, the cooling will be achieved by making clouds reflect a bit more sunlight back to space than they would otherwise, and less sunlight reaching the surface would tend to cool the planet.
So let's say we were doing geoengineering because we wanted to make the weather a little bit better.
The more we see these trails in the sky, the less rain we get. Virtually all scientific data, even from the proponents of geoengineering, state clearly saturating the atmosphere with particulates will create drought.
Much has been made of this issue of damage from precipitation.
If the issue is understanding the climatic response, which was I think most of where this was going, and it's exactly where the precipitation gets higher or lower.
There will be monsoon failures during that period, there'll be huge hurricanes.
It's likely to cause some damage in some places.
The global studies indicate there will be some impact on precipitation patterns, and obviously there's a lot more opportunity for work in that area. Just seeding can be pretty effective for the clouds we explored, but the interactions between seeding and precipitation in the form of drizzle are really complex.
So we're finding the aerosols, the metal particulates, the weather engineering, whether it's scalar, ionic, or orgone, or the chi of the atmosphere, all of those can be used and leveraged to create weather events that are several standard deviations or outside what would be typically normal. Before jumping on the chemtrail bandwagon was I needed a motive. Without a motive, you can't say what they're doing and why they're doing it. You have to have a motive.
Weather derivatives are products that commercial hedgers would use, such as an insurance company or an energy company, to hedge risk that's associated with weather. Precipitation or a hurricane or general heating days is what they're basically called. Certain temperatures or higher temperatures are going to associate with more energy, so they're going to want to hedge that risk. If you can structure a product where you say, I'm going to buy insurance against it raining more than 10 inches in this area. If my risk is say $1 million, but I'm insuring for $10 million, then I can make it rain and collect a premium on the $10 million. Of course.
So the agenda was drought. The agenda was to kill the storm, at least in that one particular spot.
You're reducing the food security of people through deploying these kinds of approaches that potentially 2 billion people could have their food disrupted by such interventions.
It affects farmers by their ability to plan what they're going to be growing.
You see a tremendous and significant loss of property and crop production. Many times this will cause farms to go out of business, and when farmers go out of business they usually have to sell, and then if there's somebody waiting in the wings to buy their land and then turn that land over to the production of genetically modified crops, you can see where there would be kind of a strategic advantage there.
The fact that it's cheap isn't necessarily a good thing at all, as I'll come to in a second. The fact that it's cheap is part of the hard problem of governance. The fact that it's cheap means any small state or even conceivably individuals could do this, and that is a very dangerous thing.
There's only probably under $10 million per year, and maybe far less than that, being spent on geoengineering research. It's a mix of a handful of government grants and some private money, including support from Bill Gates.
There is a line of research on what's called geoengineering. The climate getting worse means that many years their crops won't grow. There'll be too much rain, not enough rain. Things will change in ways that their fragile environment simply can't support.
Bill Gates invests in geoengineering and he profits from the destruction through his investment in Monsanto. Monsanto is coming in and they're saying, we have a solution for your problems. Basically, if you control the weather and the seed source, you essentially control all food production.
You can kill a storm in place. That's easy to do with HAARP. You just change the polarization, you change the ionization of the atmosphere, and the storm will fall apart.
HAARP is actually an acronym for High Altitude Active Aurora Research Program, and it in the patents for the HAARP system, it describes what is detailed as ionospheric heating. Creates situations where crops are either so severely flooded that they're destroyed.
And so it's very easy to add those particulates of aluminum, barium, and whatever else they want to put in there. And as you add heat to that, those particulates then radiate the heat into the atmosphere and it warms. Let's just say the storms can develop more violently, more quickly, in places that are not necessarily as where you would expect them to be.
We have altered weather patterns that are also stated as consequences of geoengineering. Since these global weather modification programs appear to have been ramped up so radically in the last decade, our weather here has changed unimaginably.
And we've got technologies available to us now that can do, continent-sized projects. Is all of the persistent trails behind it. So that tells me, Michael, that they are engineering this storm to a great degree. Now, all of this stuff is chemtrail debris or chemtrail clouds that had been laid down over Utah and over southern Colorado earlier in the day.
What we see in the sky matches virtually all geoengineering patents. The fact that hundreds of lab tests taken from all over the globe match exactly the ingredients stated in geoengineering patents as primary elements.
But not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad.
One of the most hardy brush forms known, the manzanita, and it looks like it's been hit with insecticide. And we're seeing this throughout the ecosystem. And there's virtually no growth, and we see whole plants, whole mature plants, 50, 60, 70-year-old, almost trees die out for no reason whatsoever that we can find other than the contaminated soils. So if it's in the rain, it's in the soil. And now we see incredibly hardy organisms dying for no other cause that we can find other than the contamination in our rain from these aerosol operations.
And so you get ecosystem collapses.
And if you control the weather, you're going to control the planet. It's that simple.
Since the release of What in the World Are They Spraying, millions of people have woken up to these crimes against nature and humanity. We believe the next prudent step, not only in waking, but also activating millions of more people and moving closer towards holding the governments and corporations responsible accountable, is addressing the weather control aspect of these damaging programs. We can't do it alone, and we need your support. This entire production will be funded by private donations and pre-orders. So see the website right at the bottom of your screen and see how you can get involved in bringing this message out to millions of people.
The work we're doing will provide cover for others to come out. And I'm most interested in whistleblowers.
Paradox here is that it's the sort of thing we see in mainstream medicine, where the more they apply their programs, the more they have to apply their programs to really cover the damage their programs did in the first place.
Oh boy, that's never a good, never a good way of going about things. So what you've said so far is almost like, okay, they've opened up Pandora's box, and now they're rushing to try to close it again, kind of.
To some degree, again, right now, I think that I believe they entered these programs believing, as psychotic people do, that they could continue this without consequence, because they put so much effort into conditioning the population to accept this as natural. From, even as I put in my presentations last, they put these into kids' animated films, and it's everywhere, so that it starts to just become normal for people, and they accept this. And I truly believe that they felt they could manipulate the Earth's climate systems for an indefinite period of time, and they now know that that is not going to happen. And the game is changing by the day, and I believe now the power structure's hand is being forced, if you will, that they are having to ramp up their time frames for whatever agendas they've had. And I think even events that would seem disconnected, for example, what's happening in Ukraine right now, and the sort of toppling of nations that our country is engaged in, and although our media paints a very different picture, we see certainly the Western powers' hand in all this disruption with other countries. And I think that they're really speeding up their agendas, because as the curtain gets pulled back, and as people, with this one issue, with geoengineering, as the critical mass of population realizes what has happened, that their health has been permanently compromised, in many cases, kids with autism, people with Alzheimer's, so forth, that there will be a fury and a panic in society that will be unstoppable. And I think the power structure knows this. They're preparing for it. We have the 2.2 billion rounds of 40 caliber hollow point that's been ordered. People should be clearly alarmed as hell about that. And I think a lot of preparations are being made, Heinrich. I think they're being made as fast as the power structure can make them. In the meantime, much of the American public still sleeps.
Yeah. One thing that seems to be certain, though, is that we're definitely entering into a period of extremes, and we're experiencing kind of a lot of it at the same time. I think one of the biggest issues that kind of proves this is what's happening in the United States at the moment with a drought and really warm weather on the West Coast, right? And then really cold with this polar vortex thing pushing down into the East Coast. And it's like it's dividing the United States in half almost. How is that possible? What's happening there?
It's not possible without climate engineering. And in fact, I'm posting 4 NOAA maps in an article I should have out tomorrow that show exactly the scenario you just outlined. It's meteorologically speaking, it's simply hard to believe that such a map could be pinned, let alone be real. But that's what you have. And so people on the East Coast, and there's highly populated areas there, so there's a lot of people that are being influenced by this colder weather that think, well, there's extremes in every direction. But the cold extremes, I would argue, and I believe data supports completely, are being engineered from top to bottom. We know that the snow is being nucleated. We know that for a fact. And it doesn't mean there's not natural snow in places, but we know that storms are heavily nucleated. We have lab tests to prove it. So at this point, whether the western U.S. is a climate sacrifice zone, being that as they're keeping this dome of high pressure over the west, it's diverted the jet stream up through Alaska, and then it pinwheels in a clockwise motion back down, carrying cool air with it, and they're nucleating that moisture. So they pick up moisture from the Pacific, they pump it up through Alaska. Alaska, by the way, just had its warmest January on record. Now, this is something that media simply doesn't cover. Why? Because they're no longer talking about global warming. They simply want to hide it. So Alaska just had its warmest January on record, and that air then pumps down, but they're able to cool off parts of the lower 48 with heavy nucleation. And California, again, might be a climate sacrifice zone. But it appears other agendas are being carried out with the drought in California. For example, there's a quest by the feds to lock down water rights, lock down control over people's ability to sustain themselves here with agricultural land. You have multinational corporations that seem to be snapping up the land of the private farmer that can't support himself with no water anymore. And we saw similar circumstances happen in Australia where huge regions were droughted out so bad from the climate engineering programs, and that whole regions sold for pennies on the dollar, whole towns, and big multinational ag bought it up. Now the rain's falling. In Africa, over previous decades, these countries that have been droughted out again and again that they attribute to climate change, we believe geoengineering is the more likely scenario because the atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree of warming. It should be raining more, not less. And the term climate change, when did they implement that term? They implemented it in 99, approximately 98, 99, when the geoengineering programs were really unleashed on a much larger scale. So they had to have a term that conditioned people to think that these gargantuan swings in weather from day to day were somehow part of what was naturally unfolding. Couldn't be further from the truth. So people have been conditioned again and again and again where without these climate engineering programs and the short-term cooling events they cause, the warming would be much more protracted. And I believe we're very close to them not being able to manipulate people's perception. Some contacts we have in Mexico indicated that Mexico had pushed back, didn't want this happening in their airspace, and there seemed to have been a cessation of the spraying over Mexico for a time. And then the swine flu outbreak happened, if you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately after the spraying ensued. So was that all connected? Perhaps. And we saw similar circumstances in Ireland where those are the only two countries who really had any data that seemed credible at all that they were pushing back against these programs. Then Ireland was financially crushed. So the gravity of these programs cannot be overstated. This is the biggest hammer of all. And even Snowden, did you happen to see the Snowden release that, although some try to discredit it, I feel it was valid, relating to geoengineering? Did you see that?
Yeah, I did.
And I feel that release was credible, and that the documents Snowden referred to said exactly what we would expect a government document of that nature to state, that if not for these programs, the climate system would fly apart within a year, and they went on to make other statements. And they also called this the crown jewel of the U.S. defense system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, it's really the ultimate weapon because you can win a war without firing a shot. So, and from the perspective of those in power who feel they have to control everything, yes, it's called double collapse scenario. From their perspective, if you stop geoengineering once you start, and this is what they try to sell us also, that the climate backlash would be horrific. And that's correct. When you keep a lid on a boiling kettle and you pop it off, there can be a splash. But that's the only choice. No matter how violent the Earth's response, it's trying to cool itself. It's trying to right itself. It's trying to reach equilibrium. And anything but allowing it to do that is pure folly, especially when we're talking about killing the ecosystem. And these particulates are virtually killing the boreal forests. They're toxifying oceans, sea life, marine life. There was a study of whales in 2010, 1,000 whales from around the globe that had, according to the report, and I quote directly, jaw-dropping levels of aluminum in these whales. There's nowhere you can hide from this, and our boreal forests are virtually imploding. Aluminum, effective bioavailable aluminum on organisms like trees is fairly well documented. They shut down nutrient uptake to avoid this toxin. It affects their DNA. So instead of boreal forests thriving from increased rainfall and more acidity in the rain, they're imploding. The ecosystem is imploding. So now the forests, instead of being carbon sinks, they're carbon sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, you know, from top to bottom, these programs are absolutely derailing every natural response mechanism on the planet. I found photos of the U.S. or the Soviet weather modification scientists touring the U.S. in 1968, height of the Cold War, touring the U.S. weather modification facilities. Clearly collaboration at the height of the Cold War. But now, we just had last fall, when the IPCC report came out, largest scientific panel in human history, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Russia asked them to address geoengineering. There wasn't going to be a single word about geoengineering in that report, but Russia asked them to. So is it possible now that Russia is having second thoughts about these programs? And we see a tremendous lashing out at Russia right now.
Yeah, certainly.
In the country,
yeah.
Correct? So is it possible that there's a fraying in the power structure, that the totality of what's unfolding here is starting to at least appear to certain people? And I think at that point, the fact that Putin asked them to address this issue is well worth note, and it's a sign of sanity that we do not see coming from our government. And are the events in Kiev related to this? Perhaps. So it's at this point there's enough data to know, and there's some recent science study that indicates clearly, due to simply the disruption of the hydrological cycle alone, not only do we know now that geoengineering is not working, we know it can't work. It cannot work. So, but when they're completely invested in this, and when the consequences of this word getting out are considered, they will try to hide it as long as they can, because you have a population that I believe would want to hunt down anyone and everyone involved in these programs if they really knew. And I think that they will hide it to the last minute. But if we can reach critical mass and get this out in the open, I think our paradigm will take a big turn in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, Putin doesn't seem to be as easily controlled and willing to play ball as the others, at least. Again, it's very difficult to kind of determine what actually is going on and who's pulling the strings. But Russia has done a lot of measures in the last 10, 15 years, really, that suggest that they want to remain more sovereign, shall we say.
I agree. And right now, I think, I mean, when you see John Kerry stand up and say that no country has the right to interfere with another country's sovereign affairs, how deep can the hypocrisy go?
Oh my God, it's right when we do it and when the NATO intervene and the quote-unquote allied or whatever, but when anyone else does it, Russia in that case, it's just wrong, right? That's the logic we're expected to accept here.
I don't have the words for watching him. You know, I can hardly stand to look at him. You know, but I think the world is waking up to this quite rapidly. And if the dollar is lost as a global reserve currency, that's going to change the game immediately as well. But right now, the climate unraveling alone, I believe, can't be hidden much longer, and it's just a race, again, a race to the intersection of whether we get word out in time or whether they drop another shoe on us, because I don't know what, at this point, the power structure being more cornered every day, what are they capable of? What will they do? I think that's a grave question.